Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the IIP, we welcome you in our premises. The guests from Austria, the guests from Belarus, very much welcome here tonight. We certainly have an interesting guest here, Artyom Shraibman, from Belarus, who is a political analyst. I said political analyst is a very high on the agenda, is a high level of expectations, but he's said, no, keep it low. But nevertheless, as colleagues who know him, he will present good ideas about the development in Belarus. Now, Belarus was not very high on the agenda for many years inside the European Union. We, the European Union, including in the European Parliament, we always had in the past discussions, debates. How should we treat the country, the government, the president? You know, there were times of sanctions, of trying to isolate Belarus. I was always on with those who said we have to talk, we have to engage ourselves in a debate and discussions. And the opponents, mainly coming from Poland and some other countries, but very often said, no, they are not democratically elected, the members of the Belarusian parliament. They are not democratically elected, the members of the government, and therefore it would be a humiliation of those in opposition, especially those, of course, who have been in prison. So there was always this kind of debate. The majority, I must say, was mostly with those who rejected an intensive dialogue with those representatives of Belarus who have been nominated by the government. Times changed, fortunately. Things became more easy, more flexible. Was the situation and the policies of the Belarusian president, also on the side of the European Union, greater flexibility and the readiness to invite and to include representatives of Belarus at the different levels of European dialogue. I'm very happy about that because I don't think that isolation and sanctions are the very efficient instruments in bringing change. And it's not about us to bring change in the government or in the president. It's about the people inside the country to bring the change, but they, of course, they could have and should have the opportunity. Now, geopolitically, also there have been some changes, and the president of Belarus and the government used some of these changes to have a greater room of maneuver. And we know that, especially concerning the situation in Ukraine, there are some activities from the side of Belarus, and Belarus is organizing different events in Minsk, especially inviting people from West and East to discuss different issues, including when, for example, Hans Gärtner has been there, including the question of neutrality or the question of non-alignment and how to deal with two difficult neighbors, so to say, Russia on the one hand and, of course, European Union on the other hand. So I think it is a very important subject and very important to have Artyom here as a guest, and I want to hand over the microphone to Marylia, our assistant, who is also coming from Belarus, and who will lead the discussion. And then, of course, also discussion with you. You're invited to come, and again, guests from Austria, but also from Belarus who are here, who are welcome, and we're happy that you're here, and we can have this discussion tonight. So you have your microphones. Please, start.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome from my side, too. We will discuss Belarus tonight, as was already mentioned. I would like to welcome our guest speaker today, Artyom Shraibman, who is a political analyst in Belarus. He is a founder of Sense Analytics, which is a consultancy agency that provides political analysis on Belarus. And he's also a regular contributor to Belarusian media, as well as Carnegie Moscow and other international research institutions. Artyom has a professional background in journalism. He worked previously in Belarusian media, and he also worked for a while at BBC in London. He has a degree in international law from the Belarus State University and master's degree in political science and communications from London School of Economics. Artyom, thank you for being with us tonight here. And I will just maybe make a short introduction or throw in some questions that you would hopefully then address in your 20-30 minutes presentations before we open the discussion for the audience. So President Lukashenko is coming to Vienna next week already, and this is quite a significant event for Belarus. Just for background, Belarusian president was in the EU last time in 2016. He visited Vatican City, and before that he went to Vatican and Rome in 2009, and in 2009 also he visited Lithuania, and in 2010 Switzerland. So basically it was the last time he visited officially the EU, almost 10 years ago more or less. So what changed now would be the first question. Why is the EU maybe suddenly or not that suddenly inviting him again? Well, not the EU, but at least the Austrian president. Although the EU also invited President Lukashenko this year and a year ago to attend the Eastern Partnership Summit in Brussels, which he didn't do, but at least he received the invitation. And this all comes at a time when Belarus-Russia relations are also somehow in crisis. Russia is demanding integration on different levels within this union state of Belarus and Russia, and this is all getting linked to lower fuel prices that Belarus has been getting from Russia for already quite a while, basically since the end of the Soviet Union, but now it's for the first time been linked to deeper integration within the Union state. So how did that come up? Why has it become an issue right now? And also on the EU approach, if you could elaborate a little bit more on why the EU suddenly, or at least it seems so, has become more cooperative towards Belarus, despite the fact that no civic or political freedoms, so the situation with civic political freedoms has not become better, and the EU has been demanding that for a long time, but somehow it did not happen, but still the EU opened more to Belarus. It lifted almost all the sanctions as well as the US. So I guess these are the couple of questions, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of you for coming, and for International Institute of Peace for having me second time already. It's a privilege. To be honest, I was planning to build my introductory remarks in this three elephants way, with discussion first on the domestic policy, then on the relations with the EU, and then relations with Russia as a dessert. And probably I will stick to this, and I'll cover your questions as I go along, if you don't mind. So starting with domestic politics, as you partly justly mentioned, not much has changed in Belarus structurally. Belarus remains and most likely will remain a consolidated authoritarian regime with president in full control over the political landscape, even not just de facto but constitutionally. Belarusian president dominates over the other branches of power. And the current election that is going on now in Belarus, parliamentary campaign, pretty much confirms the stability of this, the status quo remains. There is, as already noted, unequal treatment of the opposition and pro-governmental candidate. There is a high percentage of non-registration of opposition candidates, of censoring them their TV addresses, things like this. 2 sitting opposition MPs were barred from running, not given the registration at all as a candidate. Most hardline opposition candidates are being removed now from the race post-registration, and ballot counting will, as usually, most likely will not be transparent, and you will hear probably from the OSCE rather soon about this. However, this does not preclude the composition of the next parliament, and I would not suggest that I know now for sure that the repressive pro-authoritarian trend has won in this regard. Opposition in Belarusian parliament has always been not the sign of the growing oppositional support, because elections in Belarus are not about competing and then fairly counting this public support. It's about the governmental attitudes towards the relations with the EU at the moment. Therefore, if the presidential administration considers that it is meaningful to have and reasonable to have to retain this opposition quota in parliament, we might see that despite the restrictive manner in which parliamentary campaign is going now, opposition might preserve or at least be granted some of the seats in the legislature. However, what has changed, and this partly influences and partly answers your question, is that since 2015, 2016, after the EU and Belarus has set on this dialogue course of relations, Belarusian authorities have put some informal, let's say, limits on the scale of repressions that they, conduct in the country. Since 2015, we did not have political prisoners recognized by international community. We have only occasional, very, compared to the past, restrained breakups of the oppositional non-authorized demonstrations. So the government and the presidential administration and the power ministries in a way moderate their behavior with EU-Belarus relations in mind to a degree. We don't, and that is, by the way, why for several years now Russia is behind Belarus in some of the Freedom House democracy rating and things like this, because Belarusian authorities are now starting to care about their image first and foremost among those Western partners who still pay some attention to human rights record. And what also changes in the recent months, I would say, or last year in Belarus, is central government is paying far more attention to local social protests. And this is not just paying attention, but becoming more sensitive to them and being ready to compromise on some of them. I can bring you some examples of ecological protests in the city of Brest, where government unexpectedly conceded to a few hundreds of protesters and shut down the battery plant that they were protesting, and even put several businessmen in jail who were constructing this. Then there is the movement, also not really a large-scale movement of mothers of those who are convicted of drug-related crimes. And this initiative also gained some recognition by the government. Presidential administration had met with them several times, and the government initiated amnesty, and now the new reforms of the legislation in this area are under consideration. So what I'm trying to say is that Belarusian authorities have now adjusted their line of course of action in domestic policies. It's A, moderate level of repressions, B, more attentive attention to social protests in order for them not to politicize in a way. They want to prevent social, local, grassroots protests from becoming political, where they think they would have to crack down on them. Also, just finishing, wrapping up the domestic part of my introductory remarks, there is a lot of conversations being had by the authorities, by the president as well, about the upcoming constitutional reform in Belarus. Lukashenko personally has returned to this topic 5 times, if I'm not mistaken, since the beginning of this year only. He basically announced that somewhere in between 2020 and 2024, Belarus will update its constitution. And of course, it doesn't mean any radical reforms, but at least in his words, it is the delegation of some powers from the president to the level of government and parliament. And even Lukashenko did not conceal the purpose of this reform. He said that he does not want his successor to inherit this constitution that Lukashenko has, basically the Putin president to a king-like position with the massive powers in many branches of government. And this is done for the obvious reason, because this is the attempt to make the transit of power, which Lukashenko also is starting to think about, more smooth in a way, because president, his family, his closer circle, in all the authoritarian countries, if they decide to initiate a power transit, they need safeguards, they need guarantees, and handing over all the powers, absolute powers, to one person, one successor, can be risky. And therefore many leaders of the political systems similar to Belarusian one, take example of Nazarbayev, do introduce some, backstops, as one would say, the European Union, or safeguards. And for Lukashenko, evidently what he has in mind is introducing some more powers to parliament and government, where presumably he will still retain some control mechanism after he departs from the official position. And we are now speaking about quite a distant perspective. So I'm not saying that this will happen in the next 5 years. Most probably, even if Lukashenko holds to his deadline to get the constitution revised by 2024, he will not step down, I would say, before 2025 even in this scenario. However, if some crises, let it be political or economic, intervene, and the Russian authorities decide that it's not the high time for constitutional experiments, all these deadlines will be postponed, most surely. Therefore, we are just now observing some default track being set, but it can be adjusted and modified in future. Now, to relations with the EU, what has changed? Many things have changed domestically in Belarus, sometimes things that I've described, some adjustment of level of repressions, but most importantly geopolitically. As we all know, Belarus have started to play a different role in the region due to the conflict in Ukraine, and this was appreciated by the EU and the US, and generally the West. There has been a new dimension of Belarusian image being built around its peacekeeping mediation efforts. And if before that Belarus, if it was perceived by anyone in the West, it was also only perceived via the lenses of less dictatorship of Europe. Then after 2014, 2015, another dimension of this image, the regional peacekeeper, donor of stability, became also to get some, traction. And that gave some boost to normalizing the relations between Belarus and its Western now partners. And that is why it was a logical consequence that Lukashenko is now being invited to several EU events. It was the case several times for Eastern Partnership Summit already, but he decided not to go. He was already invited to Lithuania, he wasn't invited to Poland, but to Lithuania there was speculations that he might be. And he's already invited to Latvia, and probably after Austria, Latvia will be the second country for him to visit. At the same time, and if we look deeper at the current phase or stage in Belarus-EU relations, we are seen some palpable ceiling, reached some limit in our potential for normalizing the relations. There are several tracks of these relations, and some of them are already exhausted. I mean, visa facilitation treaty is almost signed; it's soon going to be signed, and visa facilitation and readmission agreements. No visa regime is not on the table for Belarus for many years to come. And then on the formal side of the relations, we have Belarus demanding the EU to start the basic agreement negotiations, so-called, or partnership and cooperation agreement negotiations. However, the EU said that we should first sign a more abstract, less binding document called partnership priorities, and even this document now is stuck due to the Lithuanian objections around the Belarusian nuclear power plant near the Lithuanian border. So on this front, we are either stuck on some negotiations or close to finish on other ones. And my belief is that in the next year, two sides will be in sort of desperate look for agenda, because there is so much you can do with just good atmosphere in the room. You need some agenda in your relations to discuss, and here the problems, or let's say the open questions, start. As I've said, there is no serious movement on democracy and human rights issues from Minsk, and this demoralizes discourages some Europeans from making, some EU countries or Brussels in particular, from making some bold steps in return. We'll see whether the opposition will be let into the parliament, but if it won't, it would probably even further spoil the atmosphere of dialogue between EU and Belarus. And issues like trade or investment are also moving very slowly, and I would say problematically in a way, because sides seem quite reluctant to speed up the lifting of trade barriers, for example, and there are very real institutional obstacles, because Belarus is not just the member of another trade bloc, Eurasian Economic Union, which prevents it from signing any meaningful free trade agreement with the EU, but it also is not the member of WTO yet. And therefore, it also doesn't speed up the trade negotiations with Brussels, and many barriers remain. However, despite this, in investment and banking sector, there have been some progress. Two large European banks, European Investment Bank and EBRD, were quite active in Belarus, launching several projects amounting to hundreds of millions of euros. And relations with the US, just briefly, have their own dynamic. In 2020, Minsk and Washington will exchange ambassadors, and for the first time in 12 years. And we've seen a number of very high-level visits to Belarus. So the interest in Washington obviously increases. However, this interest, in my estimation, is connected more to the regional dynamics and to Belarusian security role in the region, rather than to Belarus as a entity. Therefore, I would not expect much speeding up of this normalization of bilateral ties between Minsk and Washington on the Washington side as well, because for Washington it's quite clear security interests in the region which it pursues, and therefore it doesn't view necessarily Belarus as the value in itself, if to put it undiplomatically in a way. And also there are many concerns in especially in Washington about the topic that I am pursuing, to the prospects integration with Russia, and it also keeps some stakeholders cautious to any rapid improvement of relations with Belarus. Now, moving on to the hottest probably issue of the day, relations with Russia. Just generally, for everyone probably to be on the same page. Many problems that exist in relations between Belarus and Russia should not give you an impression that Belarus is planning or able or eager to turn to the West and to basically make this U-turn, geopolitical turnaround like some of other post-Soviet countries have done. So this has never been a zero-sum game for Minsk, and it will unlikely be so in the foreseeable future. Therefore, everything that I'm going to be speaking of should be viewed via not these lenses of with whom Belarus is, because this is not the choice that is, actual in Belarusian elite, ruling elite minds. However, there have been some more divergence among Belarus and Russia in terms of foreign policy in the recent years. Needless to say, Belarus has been in this rapprochement of relations with the EU and West in general, while Russia was moving into the opposite direction. And even on some humanitarian issues, Russia has been fortifying its borders and its visa regime and things like this, while Belarus has been lifting its visa regime, and it's also created its own, tensions between two allies. What is happening now is this year between relations between Belarus and Russia. I wouldn't describe it so far as crisis, as you put it. I would say that this is a prelude to crisis. I think
worse to come.
Yes, this is my estimation. I think that Belarus and Russia what they're doing now is painfully reconsidering the very model of their at least economic relations. And once again, many of you, especially the Belarusian participants, surely heard about it, but for local participants, I will probably elaborate a bit. Russia, several years ago, initiated this reform of its tax legislation called tax maneuver in the oil industry of Russia. But what it leads to, it deprives Belarus of some preferential terms of oil trade. Basically, by 2024, Belarus, if this tax maneuver pursues as it's planned to be, and there is no grounds to believe that it won't, by 2024, Belarus will trade oil with Russia or buy oil from Russia on the world market terms. And this is a serious hit to Belarusian economy. All the international partners and Belarus alike estimate this economic hit in about $10 billion by 2024, cumulatively only on oil. And so Belarus demanded compensation a year ago. And in December last year, Russia was, I would say, frustrated with this persistent demands on Belarusian side, and it raised the stakes quite significantly. Russia demanded a political integration, or I would say advancement of integration, and they put it, advancement of the integration within the union state of two countries. It is a 20-year-old treaty. And what I noticed is that many in Belarus were taken aback by this ultimatum in a way, but they decided to engage into the conversation because they know that they have 20 years of experience of leading negotiations with Russia in ways that does not really compromise Belarusian sovereignty, that always ends with some sort of bargains. So I think they thought that it might happen this time as well. But what we've seen in the last year, as these negotiations have been going on, Russian position have not softened. Rather to the opposite, it's become tougher. If a year ago only oil was contingent upon the integration, as the year proceeded, Russia conditioned its gas relations with Belarus, gas contract with Belarus, also dependent on how deeply integrated the countries are, and even its loans. It basically refused to give to Belarus before the integrational roadmaps are agreed. However, with that said, what also happened throughout all of this year, and both sides admitted, is that there was this downgrading of ambitions. If in December last year Medvedev spoke of joint currency, single currency, joint court, parliament, so everything that is being written into this union state treaty, which never materialized in its full, Then by the early summer, they have already removed it from the table. All of this, super integration, I would call. By the end of July, as Lukashenko and Minister Mackey of Belarus have later revealed, that by the end of July, they also removed the ideas of all the other supranational bodies. So what they are discussing now is basically harmonization of laws, harmonization of legal regimes of two countries with a view of creation of a single market. Not clear in some of these areas of harmonization what can be done beyond the current level of integration, because, for example, on customs, two countries are already in the customs union, and there is a single customs code and the exchange of information between the customs agencies. So it's not clear what can be added to this on the bilateral level, most likely nothing. However, in some other areas like taxes, like monetary policy, there is some daylight between two positions, and as was evident from some recent remarks by Moscow, Russia expects Belarus basically to, I would say, borrow its tax code for domestic use, or rather basically implement Russian norms. And just getting a step back from this, when I said that institutions, new supranational institutions, were removed from the table, what it means basically is that we should know, as researchers, as analysts, we should no longer speak of this as an integration, because there cannot be meaningful deepening of integration without supranational institutions. Anybody who lives in the integrational bloc, like the residents of the European Union, for surely know that without the supranational bodies like European Commission, like European Parliament, like European Court of Justice, like other institutions, what countries could have is only some sort of free trade between them. Therefore, by removing this issue from the table, we are now basically not in the realm of advancing integration at all. What two sides, Russia and Belarus, now call integration is basically some domestic legal reforms of two independent nations. And this is very important to understand before somebody might ask the question about how this is the paved way to Belarus losing its sovereignty. I mean, in some world it might be, but from what is on the table now, these sorts of issues are not even remotely discussed. However, even in the current downgraded form of legal approximation, legal harmonization as we call it, I believe it is also very unlikely to succeed. Because Belarus and Russia are, if you look at it, at their track record in the last 5-10 years, they have been not particularly successful in integrating or harmonizing any even minor issues, like, let's say, cancellation of mobile roaming. Probably the easiest issue there is. Two countries canceling their roaming fees, creating some, more or less joint mobile space. And this has been in negotiations for 2 years now, and it has been blocked by lobbyists from, some say from Belarusian side, some say from Russian side. What I'm trying to show you by that is that the ideas or speculations about the plans to adopt a joint tax code in the year and a half between two countries that could not have abolished roaming fees in 2 years seems to be a bit far-fetched. And the only things that they can realistically do is harmonize laws in areas where they are harmonizable, sorry for this word, in the areas which do not in any way discriminate against national interests of either countries. This means a lot of exemptions to this joint legislation, which basically doesn't lead us to a place where Russia will likely to change its hard position on oil and gas, because such a superficial harmonization is evidently not what the Russian government had in mind with its proposed deepening of the integration. And therefore, I just don't believe that this superficial, full of holes and omissions kind of harmonization of laws will satisfy Moscow, and therefore, if Minsk realizes that this is not something that can bring all the preferences back, why at all do it? So my default prediction for the next year will be that the sides will painfully, gradually understand that that the further integration is not feasible. There is also a chance that nothing is even going to be signed by December, because in December they are going to have this big integration summit. However, I would not bet on this scenario. I'd say that most likely for the face-saving purposes, they will sign some general abstract roadmap document, only for it not to be implemented after, because, and we are now getting to the huge, eternal problem in integration of Russia and Belarus, is that there is no way, theoretically or in political history of Europe or Eurasia, where two countries of such an unequal size, economic weight, political power, were able to create an equal union of two. No matter what body you create, supranational institution, no matter what joint law you adopt, it's either going to be Belarus having some sort of veto right, some sort of 50% of vote, equal vote to Russia, or Russia will have a larger vote. The first option is basically Minsk having a veto right on what happens in Russia taxation policy, customs policy, another energy policy. This is something that Russia has never agreed to and will never agree. The second option is Belarus basically being incorporated into Russian decision-making, because the voices are unequal, and there is no almost arithmetical way to decide it. And therefore, this is partly the future and the past Belarusian strategy to obfuscate these negotiations. Whenever Russia demands more integration, whenever Russia demanded more integration in the past on single currency issues and other issues of this sort, Belarus said basically, all right, we agree to discuss it, but look, there is this third article of the Union State Treaty which says that we are equal partners. So all the bodies we create, all the things we create together should be based on on parity, principle of parity. And when Russia predictably refuses, Minsk says, come on, you see, it's now you who don't want the integration. And this strategy was used for 20 years now, has been used, and most likely will be used in the future by Belarus to torpedo basically this negotiations. How will Russia react in the midterm is an interesting question, because no one knows whether Moscow or those who will be in power in Moscow by that year, when we come to this point of admission that integration doesn't work, we don't know how these people will treat their neighborhood. We don't know whether the Russia will be satisfied with the relations with Belarus being pragmatized in a way, or the more assertive, let's say, imperialist approach would prevail in Moscow. I would say that it's not just that nobody in Belarus or Europe knows it, but nobody currently even in Russia knows it. I don't think that there is a coherent strategy in Kremlin with regards to what to do with Belarus in a midterm, not just a year long, but a midterm perspective. The last thing I say before I pass the floor is that no matter what are the tensions, no matter what are the let's say, the chosen path by Russians in the midterm perspective, I don't foresee it to become any brutal military-like scenario that is sometimes being discussed in Western media. The risks and costs for Moscow of any of the brutal campaign of pressure, like military-like pressure on Minsk, are, in my estimation, far higher than any benefits that Moscow could extract from this process. and we can talk in more detail about this particular angle in the Q&A, but I'll probably stop here, and thank you for being such an attentive audience.
Thank you very much, Artyom, for this very comprehensive analysis of what's happening inside Belarus, what's happening in the relations with the European Union and also with the USA, as well as especially deep immersion into what's happening in Russia-Belarus relations. As I see it, you paint a very grim picture of Belarus, or space for Belarus to operate in this international system. So on the one side you have the European Union, who is willing to cooperate now, but you mentioned already that there is a ceiling of this possible cooperation. You have like a couple of agreements that still can be concluded, but then what to do next? And then on the Russian side, Belarus will stay with Russia no matter what, to put it shortly, but there are very many concerns and difficulties in this relationship, which obviously and most seemingly will impact Belarus' economy. So my question would be, in all this situation, what is this space for Belarus? What can it do when neither West nor Russia are willing to support the system how it is right now? But yeah, someone already shouted it out, and that's what actually I was getting to. I want to bring up one poll where the question was asked to Belarusian population, which are the friendliest countries that Belarus has, and the three countries came up: Russia, Ukraine, and China. So Russia, Ukraine are the neighbors, so this is kind of easily to explain. But what about China? We know about some projects that they are now developing in Belarus, but is it an option for Belarus? Is it, what role does it play? And also generally, if you could address the space question.
Yes. When you say what is can it be an option for Belarus, I'm tempted to ask an option for what? Because China is not doing some integration projects in the region, and Belarus is not, candidate on becoming the member of the Chinese Union or something like this. China can help Belarus in some instances of diversifying its foreign trade, foreign policy, even foreign military policy, with regards to Russia. For example, currently Russia has refused to issue loans to Belarus, but China gave helping hand. And Belarus is now negotiating the similar size loan with China that Russia refused to give. Russia has refused to supply some modern arms systems to Belarus several years ago at the beneficial prices, and Belarus turned to China, and they together developed a joint missile rocket launcher called Polones. So in this, instances of relations, China might give some, room for maneuver. However, you should always bear in mind the scale. Trade with Russia is approximately 50% of Belarusian foreign trade, 49, 48, sometimes 50%. Trade with China is 5%. No matter how relations between Belarus and China will be, developing, it cannot properly balance out the dependency on Russian market, on Russian energy, and I would say even on Russia ideologically, because Belarusian society still lives largely in the informational space of Moscow, and Belarus will not substitute this with some Chinese TV channels, or will not become what I'm trying to say, that Belarus will not somehow magically leave the Russian area of influence and join Chinese area of influence. So this is just a very sporadic help that can be there. But at the same time, I would slightly argue with the grim description of the picture that I've painted, because I don't think that Belarus today is in a more dire situation than it was let's say, 13, 14 years ago. Those years, Belarusian government was basically isolated from the West. Contacts were minimal. Sanctions were just gearing up against Belarusian regime, and travel with the EU also was not the humanitarian dimension in relations between Belarus and the EU was never there. Belarus was one of the closest countries in the region. Relations with Russia were sometimes even more tense because we had this gas and oil wars, as they called it, when gas and oil were basically shut down after or before the new year, and we had this very, I would say, frightening scandals between Minsk and Moscow. So Belarus, in a way, despite the fact that the foreign conditions somehow economically are becoming, worse for Belarus, especially in relations with Russia, its space for maneuver, I would say, increased. Especially space for political maneuver. Its international resume, in a way, its international portfolio has changed. Now Belarus can play on different, put different hats on, not just be viewed via these lenses of with whom you are, with Russia or with the EU or with NATO, but rather try to create some new space for itself, this not necessarily neutral venue for discussion, but at least situationally neutral, as political scientists describe it. Therefore, it's not as dire. And with, as you've said, Belarus will stay with Russia no matter what. No, this is also not the binary thing. You're either with Russia no matter what, or you out of Russian space of influence. I just think that in the coming years, in the coming 10 years, let's say, Belarus and Russia will continue to become more and more distant from one another. It is a gradual process that started already in foreign policy, but now it's going to be happening in economy, because the share of Russian support will shrink, and it's already happening, and I don't think that this is a trend that anyone in Minsk can avert. And I also believe that with the opening of Belarusian financial system to new investment instruments, loans from other countries like China, probably IMF, European Bank being more active, with more potentially Western investments coming, this will create another dynamic where there will be a more, balanced worldview within the Belarusian elite, where they will not just value their relations with Russia and treat their relations with the EU as the function of the relations with Russia, so that we can, flirt with the EU to trigger Russia, to make Russia concede, and then we can forget about the EU. But the more meat there is in the relations, the more there is substance there, the more valuable European Union and Europe generally becomes for many people in Belarusian ruling elite. And therefore, it is gradual diversification. It is not necessarily movement towards neutrality. However, this is one of the possible long-term trends, because neutrality has huge support in Belarusian public, as all the polls show, and it's enshrined in Belarusian constitution, by the way. However, I do not foresee this to be realized in like 5 years' time, because still Belarus is a member of quite rigid alliances with Russia, and to leave them abruptly is not something that the Belarusian government can afford. But we are moving towards this, cooling off of the relations. And to some this is positive trend, to some this is a negative trend, but to say that it's, stable and static and set in stone, I wouldn't say this.
All right. I think now it's a good time to open the floor for questions from the audience. We will probably collect a couple of questions, and then Artyom will hopefully answer them all. There is one question over there. Gentleman in the third row. Heinz.
I have one question to the Belarus currency. Is how much is depend on the Russian ruble? How much is it can work independently? I mean, also with deflation, inflation, and so on.
Heinz had a question also.
I don't know whether it's a comment or a question, but you talked a lot about the elephants in the room. Of course, we have the European Union, Russia, Maria also mentioned China, but there's an alternative, a possibility of an alternative perspective. So just coming from Armenia, and I participated also as you did in the Minsk dialogue. So I have the impression there is more assertiveness of the in-between countries. So the in-between countries, they are very heterogeneous, so from Ukraine to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus, what you have here. However, there's some common features what they have. They are trying to hedging against the influence of the big powers, by keeping up the cooperation which is necessary. But they are looking for alternatives, whether it's economically, whether it's politically, whether it's neutrality, whether it's balancing the economic relations. The term in between was used by the OSCE report in 2015 already, so and they recognize there are some common interests, and as you mentioned also there are surveys, and in all of these countries there are surveys which say that do you want be with the West or with the East or neither one? So in all of the countries is nearly above 50% neither one. So there is the wish for more independence. And George Kennan invented the term in between in 1957, and he looked at Austria at that time and said, okay, why not create a neutral belt in Central Europe and then East Central European states. So the relations between among these in-between states, Belarus and the other countries, are there like-minded interests? Do they try to learn from each other? Because they have some, of course, some common interests. So.
Thank you. So my question is related to your comment about possibility of transition of power in Belarus. You said that Lukashenko might be looking towards, so he might be considering a transition of power soon. So I wonder how much
not soon.
Okay, not soon. Okay. So how much is it in an inevitability, or is it a speculation if it's happening in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years, to your opinion, of course? And I'm specifically interested because the Russian elections are taking place in 2014, and I think, 2024. And there is certainly a lot of speculation going among scholars as well. If the transition is happening, how is it going to be, if Putin is going to choose a successor, and different scenarios are discussed, if the system will outlive him or the system will change and collapse when he resigns. And I wonder if you think Lukashenko will look if he will follow the developments in Russia to learn some lessons for it, to see how, to use it as a blueprint of how to transition power in Belarus or how not to. Do you think there is going to be some correlation, or maybe, experience gaining, and also what the scenarios of a transition of power in Belarus could be according to you? Okay. Thank you.
Maybe we should
address some of the questions raised. I'll take them in the order of the asking. Belarus currency. I should put a disclaimer. I'm not an economist. I'm not a currency or monetary policy expert. What I can say on this issue is that Belarusian ruble, of course, as the currency of any country, depends on the currencies of its key trade partners. Therefore, as long as I've said, Russia is the key partner of Belarus, accounting for the almost 50% of Belarusian trade, there is this correlation, or rather even the causation between what happens to Russian ruble and with some lag happens to Belarusian ruble. This is not a 100% direct, correlation, but you see that usually the devaluation of Russian ruble is just, a precondition for devaluation of Belarusian ruble, so it follows usually. And it's also partly because they both, Belarusian ruble and Russian ruble, in a way depend on the oil prices, because as for Russia it's obvious, oil and gas are their main exports, products. As for Belarus, it's also partly the case, because Belarusian economy is in a way oil dependent, not because it's extracts much oil from the ground, but because it extracts much oil from Russia, and it refines it and sells it to Europe, therefore, and Ukraine as well, to European Union, I meant. And therefore, it heavily depends on this oil market. So Belarusian ruble and Russian ruble usually follow the same trends. What has been changing in the Belarusian monetary policy recently, in the last 4 years, is that the national bank has become targeting inflation instead of targeting GDP growth as it was before, and it changed the whole approach of the whole philosophy in a way of monetary policy in Belarus, because before that it was much more manual, much more hand adjusted, where the exchange rate was set by the authorities, depending on their perception what were the fair exchange rate, and it sometimes led to very rapid and abrupt devaluations of national currency. With the current monetary policy, because of the more or less free regime of currency trade and free float of Belarusian ruble, there are no more abrupt devaluation. If the fluctuation of exchange rate do happen, they happen gradually. That is the main change in the recent years. Now, on you comment about in between countries and do they learn from each other? That's the question that I've heard because of the common interests. Of course they do learn, and most commonly they learn from each other's mistakes. And that is why I'm pretty sure that Belarusian authorities and Belarusian president, this one or next one, will not go and follow the Ukrainian, path towards self-identification. Let's put it this way. Ukraine example, Georgian example have taught all the other in-between leaders what are the de facto non-formal red lines for them in their pace of change, pace of geopolitical, turns. And therefore, coming to the earlier part of your comment, if I would ever foresee Belarus becoming a more neutral country, Belarus joining this neutrality camp in a way, then it would be probably the maximum, the process of the maximum, slowness and gradualness, I'm sorry for using this not proper words, is that this will not be a fast process in any way. Belarus is the most integrated Russian neighbor with Russia. All the movement towards more non-aligned foreign policy happens on an ad hoc basis. So there is an international crisis to which Belarus takes a particular non-aligned stance. Ukraine. The same happened, by the way, partly with this short conflict between Russia and Turkey several years ago about the downed jet. Belarus also tries to be in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, although Armenia dislikes the fact that Belarus sells arms to Azerbaijan despite being in collective security treaty organization with Armenia. So this non-alignment idea in the world conflicts has become some sort of the ideology in Belarus. So this is part of it. This is like, let's say, the first building block of neutrality, but it's not the only one. Formally, Belarus remains, and most likely for foreseeable future will remain the member of Russia-led integration blocs, and among them two blocs that have military dimension to it, Union State and CSTO. And with this reality on the ground, all the conversations about possible neutrality way for Belarus are just conversations about the de facto behavior in Belarus, not of some formal Austria-like or even Finland-like status. On the transition of power, this is always a question of speculations, because no matter what, first of all, it involves a lot of mind reading. Because in the end Lukashenko will be the person who will make this decision, and it's always a very difficult task to get into his head about what he will feel about this issue when the time comes. What is pretty certain now is that I'm sure that he will not and does not plan to leave before 2025, because even his very minimalistic deadline for constitutional revision is 2024. If it pursues this scenario without any blips on the road, without any crisis intervening, it would be logical to expect him getting a next term in 2025, because there is when the next re-election would take place, and then using the next mandate in his seat between 2025 and 2030 to initiate some sort of power transfer. But it's only if the situation in the country remains more or less controlled and stable from his point of view. Now, he will definitely use or observe Russia as a case study, but more closely he will observe Kazakhstan as a case study, because the system in Russia, it's three countries with entirely three different political systems. However, Kazakhstan is closer to Belarus in the role of the president, in the near total control of the president of the system. In Russia, still it's a large country with many groups of influence, with many oligarchs to master. So the transition scenarios in Russia are not necessarily directly, implementable in Belarus. Therefore, he will probably observe much more closely the Kazakhstani example, and if by 2025, let's say, nothing goes wrong from the authoritarian eyes, right? Family is okay and safe, and the country has not gone through some existential crisis, then probably he will opt for something similar as Kazakhstan. Among the scenarios, there is also, always an issue for speculations, because there is a likelihood that he, may leave the post for physical reasons. It's also, this likelihood always exists with leaders, after 60. I'm pretty sure that he does not want to die on his post, on his current position. I think that he wants this scenario, this power transit enterprise to go in the controlled mode, so that it's not abrupt. It's not like then it's Baltic fights and winner takes all situation. He wants to grant his powers to a trusted, loyal and reliable successor, probably with less powers than he has currently, and therefore. I'd say that this is the most likely scenario: a hand-picked successor to whom the state ruling elite will be, used to during some last years of Lukashenko being in power, and then a smooth transition of power with Lukashenko retaining some of his powers after the transit, like it happens in Kazakhstan, for example. Now, who is going to this person be? There is no way to tell currently, and I'm pretty sure that he or she, most likely he, is already somewhere in the top echelons of Belarusian power, because to gain the trust you need for such an operation, you should be with president for some long time, and for this long time to be long, you should start not later than now, probably even earlier. So probably the successor is already somewhere there. Once again, I don't see the situation. I'm not consider that family, transition to the family member, son, is the most likely outcome. I don't believe this. I think that it might be the case one day if the country is in very dire crisis, or Lukashenko needs to swiftly hand over power because he's ill or something, and he doesn't have time for some experiments, political experiments, and nominating and legitimizing the successor. So he just trusts power to the person he trusts most. But this is not the likeliest scenario. I think that, in Belarus, there is no political tradition of dynasty rule. There is no evident public support for such a move, or rather to the opposite. I would say that it would trigger a lot of confusion in the society. And I would not say that the family name Lukashenko adds a lot to your legitimacy among the nomenclatura, among the ruling elite in Belarus. It's not Central Asian political tradition. And Lukashenko himself, for dozens of times, probably even hundreds of times, promised not to give his power to his sons. It's not that I trust him completely on every occasion, but to make a U-turn on these promises would be too strong even for himself. And unless some emergency intervenes, we will see something like what happened with Boris Yeltsin in '99, but with or Nazarbayev recently, but with Lukashenko staying behind for some years to come. Sorry for making it too long.
Yeah, let's take another 2 questions maximum. There were some hands before already. Yes, first row, and then a lady in the back.
Thank you very much, Artyom, for your interesting presentation, for your performance. Of course, I a little bit disagree with some points of your analysis about indoor policy, but to my point of view, you are mostly right in your conclusions about foreign policy. But I think you forget about the Eurasian integration, about this track, and Belarus will be a chair of Eurasian Economic Union. And I'm interested, what do you think about this process? What do you expect it from this?
I also want to thank you for a really interesting presentation. There was a lot of things to think about and ask about, but I will ask about what people probably think is most boring here, the opposition. So you correctly pointed out that, well, in some ways the elections, they're quite predictable. We all know what's going to happen, and we also know that if some oppositionists, we call them that, are elected, they're rather selected than elected. But I still, I wanted to ask you if you've noticed anything. Is there any interesting dynamics going on in the oppositional, in the election campaigning? So you talked about local social protests and so on, but maybe is there possible to see any developments in the oppositional camps, because it's not only one opposition, but there's different parties and people? And is there something that is specifically interesting that you could mention? Someone is doing a really good campaign, for example.
And
we should take
one more question, the last one over here. I'm sorry, maybe we can discuss the rest of it during our small reception after the event.
Yes, thank you also from my side for very precise and very interesting analysis. One specific part of it I wanted to ask a little bit for more detail, and that concerns the relations with Europe, Western Europe and the European Union. It is not really clear to me why it should be such a problem, or why it should be so difficult to improve relations on several fronts with the European Union. For example, trade relations could be improved. It doesn't have to be a full free trade agreement, but it would already provide an impulse to, for example, lower tariffs on trade in goods. It would also be completely safe for the European Union to offer visa-free travel, because there is no security threat coming from Belarus. It's a small economy. So if Ukraine gets it, which would probably be a little bit more risky, then why shouldn't Belarus also get it? It would be a small step to improve relations, to improve contacts, citizen-to-citizen contacts, and so on. And also, other projects could be of mutual interest, like, for example, interconnecting infrastructure in the transport sector, interconnecting infrastructure in the energy sector, to highlight the position of Belarus as a bridge between East and West. Do you see any really big blocks in the road that would prevent these kind of measures? And these are just examples from me, or is it really just the interest of Poland?
Okay. That's a nice summary. Now, once again, as the order is asked, Alexander, thank you, knowing about the scale of our disagreements. Thank you for complimenting at least part of my remarks. With regards to the Belarusian chairmanship in the Eurasian Economic Union, and not just there, in the Collective Security Treaty Organization as well, Belarusian representative will be its Secretary General for next, how many, 3 years, right? So Belarus will become like chair of two most important post-Soviet integration blocs. Once again, it is hard to assess whether this will bring any meaningful, changes to important relations that Belarus has with its partners. Relations with Russia are mostly happening on the bilateral track of relations, gas, oil, things like this. Even the trade of goods, which happens and is regulated by Eurasian Economic Union regulations. As we've seen, Russia is quite eager and able to block supplies of Belarusian goods to Russia, disregarding some of the Eurasian Economic Union provisions. And having a person in charge of Eurasian Economic Union will definitely, Belarusian in charge, will definitely raise the ability for Belarusian government to voice its opposition, because in the end this person will be still a Belarusian and he will be expressing the Belarusian will. But how much formal powers does the Secretariat of the Eurasian Economic Union, or in this case the Eurasian Economic Commission?
We will be the head of the council, of the highest council.
Yes, Denise, I know this. It's just that for not only for, we are now getting to discussion for Belarusian nerds in specific, but it doesn't give much powers. It doesn't give much powers and to influence Russian behavior. That's what I'm trying to say. Belarus will be probably more able to set some interesting issues for itself on the agenda of the Eurasian Economic Union, but since we have a veto right on 3 of 4 level of decision making in Eurasian Economic Union, Russia will be able to block any initiative it doesn't like. Therefore, just as Belarus is able now in the Eurasian Economic Union. Therefore, having a chair is of course good for your positioning. It of course good for you being able to raise some concerns. But apart from this, I don't believe that with the depth of the problems that exist in the relation between Russia and Belarus, having just another person there will help to solve them. And the same with the Collective Security Treaty Organization. However, what will change it probably is will be hard for Russia to use these formats of integration as some sort of pressure leverage onto Belarus, simply because the agenda of the summits will be controlled partly by Belarus as well. Now, on the opposition dynamics, it's a whole huge topic and probably worth another round table just on this. But in brief, Belarusian opposition has always existed in a very dire, I should say, situation or state of affairs. But it has just becoming worse and worse. The opposition is chronically disintegrated. They see no point in uniting their forces since political victory is not on the horizon. If you don't have any meaningful or feasible chance of the regime change, I'm not even saying about election, you don't have any motivation, incentives to unite, because if like 7 leaders need to abandon their leadership and just nominate one, they do it for some purpose. If purpose is not there, they keep disintegrated. Their reputation among Belarusian public is probably even worse than the support rate of Belarusian president in the worst economic times. We don't have a proper polls on the opposition popularity, but the ones that have been conducted even by independent, non-state or even considered by some oppositional to state polling agencies showed that the cumulative support for opposition very rarely exceeded 20%. And that's despite that not the remaining 80% support the government. It's just that most of the countries in between. And there is some interesting dynamic once again for Belarus nerds, only it's that the change of generation has happened in Belarusian opposition, so it's not anymore, most of these parties and movements are not now chaired by the same politicians who competed with Lukashenko in 90s. So in most of them there has been a change of leadership, but at the same time there have been 2 important sets of drains, brain drain and money drain. Brain-wise, you just, if you're a Belarusian, you just see it, that year by year, opposition is getting less and less talented people, coming to their ranks. Because if you are an ambitious, young, active, prone to activism person in Belarus, if you have your, active civil position, there is just no way you're going to end up in a position, almost no way, because most of the young people like myself have accustomed to the idea that opposition is, unfortunately for people who disagree with the government, is a constant loser force in a way, and therefore people who are, in other countries they would become opposition politicians, but in Belarus they tend to, manifest themselves and go to other dimensions like business, art, civil society, NGO, journalism, or they emigrate, or they go to what was called in the Soviet Union domestic immigration, when you just switch off of the politics. And that's the case, and that is why the best of the best of the best do not go to the opposition, and we are left only with people of sometimes very dubious reputations and capabilities, unfortunately, for the health of the political landscape in Belarus. At the same time, when the protests come, when the social protests do come, and this happened in 2017, for example, there was a wave of social protests in Belarus, what appeared is that because of the political landscape is basically cleansed of any alternative, opposition was the one force that, despite its lack of popularity, was able to basically head those social protests. So opposition didn't trigger those protests. Those protests appeared or emerged because of the foolish decision by the government to tax the unemployment. However, opposition was quite successful in basically, riding this wave. Opposition leaders traveled the regions of the country, they headed all the demonstrations, and when the government started to use repressions against them and detained most of the opposition leaders, what happened is on some of these demonstrations that still were taking place, there were no people with loudspeakers, with voice speakers, simply because only the opposition has at least some political, expertise in at least leading the crowds. And therefore, if in Belarus in the coming years there will be social protests again, even this weak and disenfranchised and fragmented opposition has pretty decent chance to once again head them. And on the money drain that I've mentioned, another drain, apart from brain drain, it's just that after the Ukraine crisis and after the change of this attitude from West to Belarus, there was an evident, obvious money drain coming to the opposition. The political foundations, the nation government just turned away their attention from Belarus. And even the Belarusian NGOs and even the Belarusian civil society and part of the media that were dependent on foreign donations are now feeling this. And opposition is basically, it's not just the first in this queue, it's probably the last one. Media, NGOs have more chances to get foreign funding. And finally, on the potential for Belarus-EU improvement of relations in some of these pragmatic tracks. Okay, let's take it one by one. Trade. The problem is that Belarus doesn't set all of its tariffs. Belarus is a part of the Eurasian Economic Union and a single customs territory with Russia, and the decisions are taken by 5 members. If it's blocked by someone, the initiative can be blocked by any member. There is no even the proportional voting system.
Same in the EU.
Precisely. So there cannot be unilateral, lifting of barriers on the Belarusian side. On the European side, they are seem to be very cautious to not create a preferential treatment to third countries because, as I understand it, I'm not an expert on European trade policy, but from what I understand, there are many, tiers of countries in relations with trade with EU. You have all the way from Belarus, and then probably, Armenia on a step above, then probably you have Ukraine and Georgia, then you have probably Turkey, countries like this, then Balkan countries, then probably UK after Brexit, Canada, things like this. And nobody wants to, let Belarus ahead of some queues, because it would discriminate others who waited in this line for decades sometime. And therefore, what is observed now on this trade dialogue that is happening between Belarus and EU, not regularly, probably once half a year, things like this. And what is happening is the sides first come together and realize that, for example, to allow for Belarusian exports of some particular food products, there have to be a waiting period before the inspection can come, inspection from European agencies. Then it comes, then you wait for its conclusions. It takes several years. And in the meantime, Belarusians complain that European Union does not even respond to emails for months. And the European side, on its side, Brussels complains that Belarusians are not, providing the full information of the African pig, fever, things like this. How do you call this? Swine fever. Yeah. So now the parties just started to, communicate, and they figure out that even the culture of negotiations sometimes different. And it's a very long way before some real trade obstacles can be lifted. It's just, the process is too bureaucratic.
So it's an administrative problem?
Yes, this is, partly, but there is also a formal barriers like being in different trade blocks, which is also a formal limitation on this. And Belarus not being a member of WTO is also contributing to not being able to open some doors in the EU institutions and in the US, for example. Next, on the visa-free regime, there is probably no one in Belarus who would not welcome it. It's a completely, if government opposition people, everybody will, of course, welcome this step and cheer for it. But for the visa-free regime to be granted to a country, the countries normally have to comply with more than 100 conditions. For Ukraine it was 146, if I'm not mistaken, or 47. For Georgia it was slightly less. But among those conditions that European Union usually, gives to countries to fulfill before they can enter the no visa regime are the transparency, anti-corruption, rule of law requirements, and even some like LGBT rights, things like this, safety of passports, and safety in terms of transparency of regulators, transparency of law enforcement, of prosecutor, independency of judiciary, things like this. All of this is in package. And to suggest that Belarus can achieve this to the European standards to get a visa-free regime, I wouldn't say so. And to suggest that the European Union would adjust its criteria just for Belarus to give 10 million Belarusian visa-free regime, well, this would be very kind, but this is not how European Union normally works, especially in the ages of the common obsession with migration crisis. And finally, on infrastructure and energy projects, this is the venue where the progress can be made. However, as usually with infrastructure projects, it heavily depends on funding. And Belarus, among the Eastern Partnership countries, is probably not the top-tier country for European Union to pump money into. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia get far more. because of their approximation with the EU. And Belarus, maybe not the last in the line, maybe Azerbaijan get less, but still Belarus cannot, get the maximum of the technical assistance for the infrastructure project. But this is the dimension where the most progress is possible. I agree with you, and that is why, for example, Minsk, Minister McKay and others have been coming forward with these multiple initiatives precisely on the infrastructure, cross-border, border facilitation issues like transportation initiatives, because they understand that this is the most feasible track to improve relations. But very much depends on funding, and funding depends on political will. And I would argue Belarus is not on the agenda, on the top of the agenda of European decision makers in terms to where should we, pump in our spare money.
Thank you very much, Artyom, again. We discussed a lot. We discussed domestic politics, elections, prospects of opposition getting into the parliament in 2 weeks. We discussed foreign policy, the relations with the European Union, prospects of cooperation. There were mentioned some that there is still, the ceiling is not yet reached, so something can be still done, so the picture is not that grim. We also discussed Russia and issues with Moscow, and maybe also some potential space for maneuver that Belarus still has. We also talked about neutrality, and we even mentioned China. So broad spectrum of issues, lots of food for thought. I hope you will stay with us a little bit longer. We will have a small reception just outside there with wine and snacks. You can also approach Artyom hopefully in the next half an hour or so. So thank you very much for being with us here, and wish you a pleasant evening.
Thank you.